Hi everyone. So here's Pastor Voodoo Basham debunking the whole argument that Jesus never spoke about homosexuality. Let's listen and let's respond.
Three reasons we don't have to panic when someone says, well, Jesus never addressed the issue of homosexuality. Because here's another thing. Jesus never addressed the issue of pedophilia either. Evidence that there is such a thing. There's evidence that there are people who engage in the practice of what the Bible calls sodomy. But there is no evidence that there are people who have a permanent orientation toward homosexuality. In fact, there's 2,000-year-old evidence, and you'll hear about it tomorrow, that there are people who practice homosexuality, who call themselves homosexuals, who, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, were not that anymore. Which means that being homosexual is not the same thing as being black or being white or being whatever. It's not the same thing. It's not an immutable characteristic, and nobody has proven otherwise. There is zero biological evidence that there's an immutable characteristic. If there was biological evidence, then you could prove that somebody was homosexual after they died. All you have to do is do an autopsy. You just do a postmortem, go into the brain and find that area in the brain that homosexuals have. Wait, what? Nothing in the brain? Okay, well, go into the genes and find that gene to... Oh, wait, nothing in the genes? Well, I heard about a pheromone study. You go into the pheromone... Oh, really? That was not... There's absolutely nothing that proves that there is such a thing as a person who is a homosexual. There are people who practice homosexuality, but there is nothing in the world, nothing that demonstrates that there is a class or category of people who are immutably and unchangeably homosexuals, just like I'm immutably and unchangeably a black person.
He made a valuable point. Since someone's sexual behavior becomes an identity, this is something new that we're just now seeing. You know, it's like he's gonna say it's not black, it's not white, it's a sexual behavior. So how is the sexual behavior of someone becomes their identity? And this is why when they bring these things into school, they say, well, how are we grooming your children? How are we grooming your children with teaching them about LGBTQIA, whatever they called that, the alphabet community? How are we grooming? Well, because center of homosexuality is sex. So it's not normal to bring these things into school because it all underlined into sex. And this is what I'm saying. It's like, it's so weird, or it's so like, it's very hard for me to understand this homosexuality identity. Because since someone's identity is based on their sexual partner, like for example, someone who is married with a man, a woman, heterosexual relationship, my identity is based on my relationship. How about your identity is based on how you think as a person, your uniqueness as an individual, your beliefs, your customs, your culture? That's your identity, not who you have sex with. So I do agree with the term that I don't believe there's such thing as a homosexual identity, as opposed to a type of practice that you do.
So now we can point out to the person, first of all, you're wrong, because he did address it in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. Second of all, Jesus, if you take that line of argumentation, you would have to eventually be okay with pedophilia, because Jesus never said anything about that. Dispense with that one. Okay. Second argument that people use is the argument that basically says, and this is probably the most popular argument today because of a book by a guy by the name of Matthew Vines called God and the Gay Christian. And this is a book that's popular among young Christians because Matthew Vines identifies himself as reformed, evangelical, and inerrantist. He holds a high view of Scripture, very careful exegesis, and homosexual, and supports monogamous same-sex relationships. And his argument basically is that the writers of the Bible were addressing something other than what we know as same-sex orientation. They were addressing a practice called pederasty, which was a cultural practice whereby men particularly who were heterosexual, they weren't homosexual, they didn't have a homosexual sexual orientation. They were heterosexual men, they had wives, but there were practices within the culture where they used boys for sex. And what Paul was basically saying was, how dare you heterosexual men engage in this practice that should only be engaged in by people who have an actual orientation toward homosexuality? Well, there are a number of problems with this line of argumentation. Number one, Matthew Vines ignores ancient literature that would have made it clear that Paul would have known about the same line of argumentation that Matthew Vines is using. This idea of sexual orientation is not a new idea. The second problem with that is this. Matthew Vines offers absolutely zero evidence that there is such thing as a homosexual orientation. To say something that may be surprising to you. I don't automatically agree with people when they say that they're homosexual. Because there is no evidence that there is such a thing. There's evidence that there are people who engage in the practice of what the Bible calls sodomy. But there is no evidence that there are people who have a permanent orientation toward homosexuality. In fact, there's 2,000-year-old evidence, and you'll hear about it tomorrow, that there are people who practice homosexuality, who call themselves homosexuals, who, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, were not that anymore. Which means that being homosexual is not the same thing as being black or being white or
as